Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to contribute to this motion of an apology following the Royal Commission into the institutionalised child abuse. A Royal Commission that was many years in the coming, and a commission that has done such incredibly important yet harrowing work to really put the spotlight on the suffering and the pain of so many Australian children in the institutions that were, many of them, meant to care and look after and love the children that they abused. I want to start by saying that I am sorry, and I want to associate my comments and heartfelt apology with those of every other member of this place and the other place, those who have stood and verbalised an apology, those that have acknowledged the moment's silence in the House of Representatives, and those that will do the same here shortly this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership of the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard in bringing forward this Royal Commission. There are many things that I wished Julia Gillard had done while she was Prime Minister, but I think it is fair to say that her strongest legacy will be this Royal Commission. The spotlight and the exposure of the crimes and the evil that has been done to children in institutions is unthinkable, but so important to have had happen now. It should have happened many, many years ago. It should have stopped many, many years ago. But for what we have before us today, I think we need to pay strong and honest tribute to Ms Gillard for showing leadership at the time. I also want to associate myself with the comments and pay my respect to the leadership shown by my own colleague, Senator Rachel Siewert, in relation to this issue. Senator Siewert has been fighting hard for many, many years in this place for justice and truth for many of the survivors of institutionalised child abuse, and for those who for too long remained voiceless and whose suffering and pain remained a dark secret. I also thought that the contribution in this place earlier today from Senator Christina Keneally was one that deserves to be acknowledged as well. She spoke very eloquently, and as a practising Catholic, I think her words carry incredible power. Many of us, as we have acknowledged and reflected upon the much-needed apology to those survivors today and those who didn't survive, I think it is absolutely essential that we acknowledge that the children whose childhoods were stolen had it happen almost in plain sight. Yes, they were dark secrets that the institutions were keeping, that children abused at the hands of those that were meant to care for them, look after them and love them, forced them to keep. But many, many people knew. And many, many people, adults, people in authority, stayed silent when they should have spoken up. And that is what we are truly sorry for, Mr. President. is that as adults, too many people stayed silent and allowed these children to suffer, to be abused, to be traumatised, to be re-abused and re-traumatised, some night after night, week after week, month after month, and for years. And the absolute horror of these acts are only compounded by the cover-up that associated them. There have been many accounts that have been used as part of the reporting through this Royal Commission, and many of us in this place have referred to individual stories that reflect so devastatingly the pain and the suffering that innocent children have had to carry. Tonight I wanted to focus my short time speaking on this motion to what we have to do to ensure that this never, ever happens again. And if we are honest about needing to reform the way we deal with the issue of institutionalised child abuse, we must accept that listening to children and believing them has to be first and foremost. And we have to accept that those responsible for this evil must be well and truly held to account. There is no excuse ever of abusing and hurting a child. There is no confession that can make this abuse less evil. And if we are to deal with this issue properly, we must accept that religious institutions themselves must change. Out of the 180 odd recommendations from this report, a number of them stand out in a very stark way. Recommendation 7.5, Mr. President, goes directly to the issue of the confessional. And I'll just read it for you so that we have it clearly on Hansard. Laws concerning mandatory reporting to child protection authorities should not exempt persons in religious ministry from being required to report knowledge or suspicions formed in whole or in part on the basis of information disclosed or in connection with a religious confession. No religious institution should ever excuse the abuse and trauma inflicted on children. And after years and years and decades of suffering, generational and intergenerational trauma, it is time that we acknowledge that the confessional is not an excuse for keeping child abuse secret or for protecting the abusers. It is the responsibility of any religious organisation, of any person in authority, of any adult, Mr. President, that when they see evil, they do something to stop it. And when they see children suffering, they must do something to stop it. If they suspect that a child is being abused or is suffering emotional or physical abuse, sexual abuse, they must do something about it. Any institution that refuses to comply with laws of mandatory reporting of child abuse, using the excuse of the seal of confession, I believe, Mr. President, should be prosecuted. Using the seal of confession to refuse to report child abuse does not warrant, I don't believe, Mr. President, the protection of Australian law or the funding from the Australian taxpayer. I question, Mr. President, that if the Catholic dioceses around this nation are not prepared to cede the recommendations of mandatory reporting of child abuse, I don't believe they should be receiving any public money. If you're not prepared to stick by the law that is designed to protect children, you're not playing your part as a decent institution in the community. From October the 1st this year, my home state in South Australia became the first state where priests are now legally obliged to report any confessions of child sexual abuse. In response to these laws being put in place, Mr. President, we had the leadership within the Catholic diocese in Adelaide openly say they would defy those laws. So despite everything that we have been through, all of the reporting that has gone on, the exposure of this horror and this evil, we have leadership within the Catholic Church saying they are refusing and will refuse to comply with the basic necessity of mandatory reporting. That somehow their seal of confession is more sacred than the life of an innocent child. Well, I fundamentally and strongly disagree. I hope that the public response on this issue creates pause for thought of a number of those within the leadership of the Catholic Church and the various dioceses to comply and to not use the confessional as an excuse to keep these horrible, painful, evil acts secret. The report into institutionalised child sexual abuse also dealt with, in a very sensitive manner, the other contentious issue facing religious organisations, and that, of course, is mandatory celibacy. Recommendations 16.18, 16.19 and 16.20 all go to this in the Royal Commission's final report. And I strongly support, Mr. President, that if we are to be honest and brave and pay genuine tribute to an apology to all those who have suffered, to those children who never made it, to the survivors who are still in pain and suffering today, to their children who have suffered the intergenerational trauma of this abuse, that we must also deal with forced celibacy within religious institutions. Canon law should be changed so that celibacy is not mandatory, and it should be illegal to force an individual to be celibate simply for religious tradition. And I understand that this is a very sensitive element. I understand that this is a very controversial and sacred part of religious practice. But if we are to be honest with ourselves, with the community, with the children who have suffered, we must face this and not hide behind it. There are many other good recommendations throughout this report, and I'm very pleased that the government and the opposition and the Greens and other members around this chamber and the other have agreed to take these on. We must also insist that religious institutions and the church leadership take them on as well. Let's not allow the pain and trauma to have happened in vain, Mr. President. Those two issues, the seal of confession and the enforcement of celibacy, must change if we are to ensure that we are doing everything we possibly can to protect children and young people from the type of evil and horror that we know has existed for far too long in those dark corners of institutions. And adults must do their job to protect children, to protect the innocence of children. That is what is important here. Not ancient law and practice, but the protection of the innocence of a child and their right to a childhood, to love and care and to be believed and supported. without the cover-up and without the shame.